from what he says. He that began a good work in you, he will bring it to completion. You might say, well, who else? Well, not you. Now, the way we short-circuit the process is when we take the responsibility back on ourselves. What we should do is just say, I know you're working in me, and I know you're going to bring it to completion. He says it here. He said we should be confident in that. See, if you can adopt this kind of mindset, it can give you a sense of rest and peace in that it's not, the responsibility is not laid on your shoulders. It's laid on His shoulders because He is the one that can do it. We don't really have the capacity to do it. You know, there's another one I want to read. One more, and then I promise to quit. One more that talks about this. Galatians chapter 3, verse 1. This is an interesting one. I like this one. Paul the Apostle wrote this one, and he's a little bit edgy when he writes this. He's got kind of a, as we say, if you understand this euphemism, he's got kind of a burr under his saddle here. He's kind of annoyed with them because what the Galatians have done is they have become Christians, but then they have sort of taken the idea of completing the work back on themselves. And what he says to them in verse 1 is, O foolish Galatians, who hath bewitched you, that you should not obey the truth, before whose eyes Jesus Christ hath been evidently set forth crucified among you. Now why does he say, before whose eyes Jesus Christ hath been evidently set forth crucified? He's reminding them that I came and preached to you about Jesus, and the most important thing about Jesus that I put before you is that He was crucified. He died for you. He died to save you. He said, you must have forgotten about that. Verse 2 says, this only would I learn of you. Received ye the Spirit by the works of the law, or by the hearing of faith? Then he says, are you so foolish? Here's the verse I wanted. Having begun by the Spirit, are you now made perfect by the flesh? What he's saying, it's a rhetorical question. The answer, of course, is no. He's saying, listen, if you started this Christian life, if it was a work of God, and if it was spiritual, how are you going to perfect it or make it finished by your efforts on the outside? He's basically saying the same way you start is the same way you continue, by trusting in and relying on Jesus. Now, I think you can understand that from the King James, but I like the Message translation even better. If you'd go back to verse 1, Elliot, I'd like to read the Message translation. It says, this is funny, you crazy Galatians. That's a little more pointed. King James is polite. You foolish Galatians. Here it says, you crazy Galatians. Did someone put a hex on you? Have you taken leave of your senses? Something crazy has happened. For it's obvious you no longer have the crucified Jesus in clear focus. So in other words, he wants us to have that in clear focus. His sacrifice on the cross was certainly set forth clearly enough. That was what Paul did. Okay, next verse. Let me put this question to you. How did your new life begin? Good question. How does it begin? Is it because we're down here struggling and striving and working really hard, and God looks over the banisters of heaven and says, oh, look at them down there, struggling and striving, working so hard. Man, they have really done a good job. I'll just put the finishing touches on. No, it's not like that at all. He looks at us and he says, total loss. I need to do everything. Do you understand that? Was it by working your heads off to please God? Or was it by simply responding to was it by responding to God's message to you? Well, the answer is, of course, it's just because we respond to His message. That's how it begins. Next verse. Are you going to continue this craziness? For only crazy people would think that they could complete by their own efforts what was begun by God. You see, what he's saying here is it's a God job from start to finish. And what he's also saying is the same way that we begin is the same way we proceed and the same way we finish. How do we begin? It's very simple, by faith, by trusting in Jesus. How do we continue? By faith, by trusting in Jesus. How does it end? By faith, by trusting in Jesus. You know, when Paul talks in Romans about the gospel, he calls it from faith to faith, meaning it begins in faith and ends in faith. That's our part of it. He does all the work. He does all the hard work. See, this is a refreshing thought if you can get hold of this. It means that we can lean on Him and relax and let Him work. That also means that He knows what needs to be done and is not condemning or criticizing us for what remnants of what, He's not looking at us and saying, why didn't you do better? He's saying, I'm working on you. He that began a good work will bring it to completion. Isn't that what we read? If you weren't smart enough or strong enough to begin it, how do you suppose you could perfect it? That's a good thought, isn't it? Yeah. I mean, it's kind of humbling. We like to think we're very smart and very strong. But let me just ask you this. Who's better? Who's smarter? Who's stronger? God or you? Well, I think we recognize God's smarter. He's stronger. Who could work better? Well, he can. Well, let's let him work.